Well, good afternoon. Welcome, and welcome to our guests here today. I'm Jacob Hacker. I'm the director of ISPS, and I've picked up this mic because I'd like to sing you a little song. No, just kidding. I'm going to spare you of that. And actually, I'm going to hand this off to Eitan momentarily. Eitan Hirsch, assistant professor here at Yale, a resident fellow of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and also a frequent media commentator on NPR and PBS and all other similar media outlets, BBC, the Canadian Public Broadcasting Network. And Eitan is going to tell you a little bit more about the format of the event, but he is someone who's been working in the area of political campaigns and, in fact, has brought to academics an amazing resource called Panelist, which is essentially the entire voting public of the United States in one data set. So if you could please turn off your cell phones, I'd be grateful. And Eitan knows where you live if you don't. So, and there's another note, which is up here on the wall, which is that we're recording this event. So if you don't want to appear in the prominent media outlets like NPR and PBS, please don't ask questions, I guess, right? So there are two hosts of this event. First, the Scholar Strategy Network. I'm on the steering committee of the Scholar Strategy Network, and it is an amazing institution. It's so recent that you may not have heard of it, but it already has over 500 academics and and scholars from across the United States working on important policy issues. If you're interested, you can go to scholarstrategynetwork.org. And the goal of the Scholar Strategy Network is basically to bring good research and thinking to the broader public, to policy experts, and I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, SSN as a whole does not endorse any political party, candidate, or specific policy position. In other words, it doesn't improve this message, but it does improve this conversation. And then finally, I'd just like to mention ISPS, the center I direct. The Institution for Social and Policy Studies has a long and storied history here at Yale. It was started in the 1960s, and its goal is to bring the best interdisciplinary social science research and thinking to bear on important public policy issues. And we have the Center for the Study of American Politics, which is the home for top-level American politics research at Yale. We also have a center on health policy and a new center starting up on inequality. And if you're interested in any of these topics or in the work that ISPS does, you should get signed up on our website. It's isps.yale.edu. We have a newsletter that's put together by Tori Bilski here and tells you about all the exciting things that are happening. One exciting thing that's happening is we're just about to accept our new Directors Fellows, and so you can go to the website and see what that's about, but it's Yale College students who are interested in these topics and who want to be working with ISPS to develop their skills as policy thinkers. So I will now hand off the mic to Eitan, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to all of our guests. Thank you for being here for this event about transparency and disclosure in campaign contributions. I just wanted to offer a few words of thanks and introduction before I turn it over to our speakers. Thanks. First of all, thank you to, I should thank and disclose our funders, ISPS and SSN. Thank you for your support, and thank you especially to Jacob for supporting this project. I would like to thank Pam Green, who put all the details of this together and is very attentive to detail, and thank you so much for your help in putting this together. Afterwards, everyone should stick around. We're going to have a reception where we can continue the conversation in the back up there after we're done here. Let me just say a little bit about why we're here. As many of you probably know, the Supreme Court has not looked kindly on a lot of regulations of campaign finance limits imposed by states to the federal government. But the Supreme Court has provided governments with some wiggle room in disclosure. What that means is that the court does not see it as a violation of First Amendment rights to require that the public learns about who donated what, to whom, how much. And so there could be some policy movement in this area. There hasn't been any policy reform recently yet, but there's a lot of room. There's wiggle room. And so this event is meant to try to figure out what we should do with that wiggle room and whether there is a good reason and a good outcome that we could have from requiring more disclosure in political contributions. Why are we doing this event here? This is not actually an area of campaign finance that I've been particularly interested in researching so far, or that I haven't conducted research in. But when Jacob suggested we do an event, I was excited about this topic really for two reasons. And so I want to tell you those two reasons. The first reason is that this is an area of public discourse, campaign finance, that is very politicized, very polarized. People have very strong views, and those views tend to be steeped in a language of partisanship. And I think that's a shame because the issues at play here are serious and difficult. They pit two of our most important values against one another, our value of free expression and speech related to politics and to elections, with this value of having a kind of election that has integrity and a clean election that we think supports our democratic values. And these are both kind of wishy-washy concepts, but they're both concepts that we talk and care a lot about. And we can have a debate about what those concepts mean and how which values should hold more weight. But oftentimes the debate we have is just about partisan sides. And so I think at ISPS in particular, we can present an issue like this in a way that we set aside our partisan inclinations and focus more on the issues. And so that's one of the reasons I think we're here today. Another reason we're here today is that disclosure laws in particular and policy reform about disclosure demands empirical evidence. Not all areas of public policy are quite like this, that the debate between two sides, one side can sink or swim based on empirical evidence, but this is one of them, right? If we care to know that, if we think that disclosure laws are going to do X, Y, or Z, we want to try to provide some tests for that. And so there's an opportunity here for empirical social scientists, which half our panel is, to talk to folks who are engaged in policy reform and the legal side of public policy, which the other half of the panel is, to try to connect empirical evidence and research with policymaking. Right? Campaign finance is an area of law where there's a lot of lawyerly assertions, no offense, a lot of assertions about what it means that there might be corruption, or if campaign finance laws are supposed to, if disclosure laws are supposed to change the behavior of voters or of donors or of politicians, the political scientists among us want to say, prove it, prove what you think is happening. And so by bringing two sides together, the social scientists with the lawyers, we hope to be advancing this debate, and I think that's right in line with the agenda of ISPS and with the Scholar Strategy Network. And so that's why we're here. And so I hope we're going to have a great conversation. Our format is as follows. Each of our four speakers are going to talk, one after the other, for about 8 or 10 minutes about campaign finance laws, about disclosure laws, about social science research on campaign finance, and about social science research on disclosure laws. And then we're going to open it up for discussion panelist to panelist, and then we're also going to welcome your comments. So please, for the first part of the conversation, start taking notes and see what you want to ask about, and then we'll have plenty of opportunity for group discussion. Let me just introduce our panelists briefly. Trevor Potter here is a distinguished actor who plays a lawyer on television. Trevor Potter is a distinguished lawyer who has sometimes been on television as his role as Stephen Colbert's lawyer, but in real life, he is in the law firm Kaplan in Drysdale. He's the founding president of the Campaign Legal Center, former commissioner and chairman of the Federal Election Commission, general counsel to the McCain campaigns for president, a defender of the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and one of the most the prominent, distinguished lawyers in this field. Heather Gerken is from our law school here. She's the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law, author of many great articles, a former clerk for Justice Souter, author of a great book about a really neat idea for improving election law called the Democracy Index, and a wonderful teacher and scholar. Next, the third speaker will be Ray LaRaja, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, author of many books and articles, including the forthcoming book, Money and Politics and Party Polarization in the States. I will say that Ray LaRaja was was writing and thinking about campaign finance way before it was cool, in the sense that a lot of folks are paying attention to campaign finance now and since the Citizens United ruling in 2010. But Ray was cranking out articles on this 10 years or more before that, and because of that reason, he is certainly one of the most distinguished scholars, maybe the most distinguished scholars writing in this area of campaign finance. And last, we have David Primo, Associate Professor of Political Science at Rochester, who has written many great articles on a wide range of topics, and especially relevant to our panel here, David has been conducting really interesting and innovative studies on the effects of campaign finance disclosure. And with that, I will turn it over to Trevor. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here at Yale and at ISPS. I'm delighted to receive the invitation to have an extensive conversation about what I think is a terrifically important subject. So I'm glad that you thought of this and look forward to the conversation coming. You are right that there are some dangers of appearing on late night television. After I'd done the Colbert show a couple of times, the rapport, I ran into someone in a legal context, and I was introduced to this person, and we were having a conversation, and she kept looking at me strangely, and she said, "How do you know so much about law?" I said, "Well, I'm a lawyer." She said, "You're a real lawyer?" "I just thought you were an actor." So I'm glad to be back on real legal turf. Thanks for that. Disclosure is a really interesting subject to talk about, particularly after the election we have just had. I think it's fair to say that historically, disclosure was often described as one of those mom and apple pie subjects where people, whatever else they disagreed on in the political world, always ended by saying, "But of course, full disclosure." They may not have always meant it, but that's certainly what they said. Today, the situation is different, and I think discussing where we are, how we got here, and where we go from here is worth some time, because it's an important and I think interesting subject. Disclosure of political contributions and then political expenditures has been required in one form or another for most of the last 100 years, at least in federal elections. We had the Publicity Act and then the Corrupt Practices Act in the early 20th century, both following campaign finance or ethics scandals. Then we had the post-Watergate reforms, actually the 71 Disclosure Act and the 74 Federal Election Campaign Act, following the Watergate scandals. We had 527 disclosure following the 2000 election, McCain-Feingold in 2002, and then not an act, but a Supreme Court decision, Citizens United in 2010, which in a complicated way I'll explain, actually appeared to extend disclosure. So that's a century of talking about disclosure. There's obviously a reason that it went on for a century and continues today. So first, what are the rationales? And since I'm a lawyer, I'm going to look at it from the legal side of what the courts have said, and maybe the political scientists will do a better job of explaining the other rationales. But from a legal perspective, what are the rationales that have upheld disclosure requirements in the courts? The first is anti-corruption, the simple idea that it's important to know who is giving what to whom, who is potentially buying what. So knowing the contributions going in particular, but also the source of the expenditures that may elect somebody has been considered an anti-corruption rationale, going all the way back to the Burroughs case in '34, and then the seminal case on campaign finance, Buckley v. Vallejo, after the Watergate reforms, where the court really for the first time looked at a comprehensive campaign finance regulation system and talked about what was constitutional and why. And there again, they said that there are a couple of reasons to uphold disclosure requirements, but they started with combating corruption, actual or apparent corruption, which they said can be combated by exposing campaign fundraising and spending to public scrutiny. So that's the corruption rationale. There's a different one, usually called the informational interest. And in Buckley, what the court said is, disclosure provides the electorate with information as to where political campaign money comes from and how it is spent by the candidate in order to aid the voters in evaluating those who seek federal office. It allows voters to place each candidate in the political spectrum more precisely than is often possible solely on the basis of party labels and campaign speeches. The sources of a candidate's financial support also alert the voter to the interests to which a candidate is most likely to be responsive and thus facilitate predictions of future performance in office. So this is, voters will learn something about candidates by knowing who supports them. It's kind of a coding system. And it thus, the court says, provides additional information that help voters make decisions. That concept was further fleshed out by the Supreme Court in the Bellotti decision, where it said disclosure enables voters to evaluate the credibility of the speaker and thus the credibility of the political message. So the concept is you see an ad and it may make a difference to you as a voter to know who is speaking, who is financing this ad, and it will enable you to decide what you think of the ad. So it's the concept is it isn't just the message, it's who the messenger is that is relevant to the voter. And then a slightly different view than informational, what you might call sort of a democracy value approach, is Justice Scalia's. And his theory is that active citizen responsibility is encouraged when citizens have to stand up and be counted and participate to be heard. His quote, coming out of a case out of Washington State where the question was, did people who signed petitions have to have their names be public? He said, requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. Justice Scalia always has a colorful way of noting things. So that's the court's over time list of why we want disclosure. Anti-corruption, the idea of fostering civic courage, and informational, that it tells voters something about who is speaking and thus the arguments and the candidates. There is a balancing aspect of this in the courts. Going back to the Buckley case and looking at some earlier cases where the court has said that these public benefits of disclosure can, in some circumstances, be outweighed by dangers, by hardships, and that in extreme circumstances, disclosure will give way to protecting people from hardships. The extreme circumstance the court was referring to was a case out of the civil rights era of the 1950s called NAACP v. Alabama, where Alabama was requiring the NAACP to disclose its list of members. And what the court found was that this was an unpopular minority threatened by the KKK and other groups with actual physical violence and death. There were bombings, there were shootings, and you had a state where the police were not, in fact, protecting the NAACP and its members, and so you had the double whammy of people actually prepared to engage in physical violence if names were disclosed, and a state that was not standing in the way and protecting them. And so there, the court said, the NAACP did not need to disclose its list of members. So we need to keep in mind in the disclosure argument, and there is an ongoing debate about which I'm sure we'll say more, where the level of violence is, where the level of danger is to the speaker. But like everything else in the Constitution, there is some balancing, and while disclosure is important, there may be circumstances where there are exceptions to it. Another implicit exception in the sort of rubric of bad facts make bad law is a case called McIntyre, the 1980s, where those of us in the field tend to refer to it as the little old lady in tennis shoes exception. But that's a case where somebody was opposing a local school tax initiative or issue and put flyers under the car windows in parking lots and was charged by the state of Ohio with failing to disclose her identity on the flyers as state law required. And basically the court said there are circumstances where we're going to allow anonymous speech. We're talking about almost no money. We're not talking about an organized effort, and we're not even talking about a candidate election. We're talking about initiative campaigns. They then came back in other cases and said, but that applies to basically little old ladies in tennis sneakers, because if it's a big initiative campaign, we're going to uphold the constitutionality of disclosure. So that's the theory. Those are the general exceptions. Where are we now? Let me talk a little bit about what I think is the philosophical dispute through all of that period, and then get to the specifics of our current disclosure situation. I think the issue that we face here is assuming that disclosure to candidates and parties is generally going to be required and the courts will uphold that. How much further can disclosure go? How much further can the legislature take it? Where do we begin to hit, if there are, the edges of permissible requirements for disclosure? And that really focuses on what are called outside spenders. The theory is you have candidates who run against each other, you have political parties who support them, and then you have everyone else, known as an outside interest or an outside spender. And our system, as I expect the political scientists will talk about, has changed enormously and with considerable velocity in the last couple of years in terms of the degree of outside spending that has occurred. So the question becomes, if you're not a candidate and you're not a party committee, when do you have to disclose? If I stand here and say something good about a candidate, do I have to disclose? Well, I may not be spending money, but if it took money to get here. If I'm an organized group, that is focused on an issue and I start talking about candidates, if I'm an organized group that focuses all my activity on elections, if I'm a group created with a wink and a nod from a candidate and my principal purpose appears to be to aid the candidate's election, where in this spectrum do disclosure laws hit me and how are those written? So that's been much of the current debate, and in the debate over time as the laws have been written, of what to cover and what not to cover. It started with candidates and parties. It moved to political committees under the post-Watergate rules. And then we saw in the 90s and the early 2000s a series of, again, what are called outside groups, but individuals who wanted to speak and were looking for ways to do so without having to disclose their identities. And in the mid-90s, there was a small boomlet in speaking through what are called 501c4 organizations, social welfare groups under the tax code, that don't register with the FEC and report their donors. They register with the IRS. They report their activity the year after they've done it, so after the election cycle is over, and they don't publicly disclose their donors. Now, back in the 1990s, after a cycle of that, it looked from a legal perspective that C4s were an awkward vehicle for this. There were tax issues about whether gift taxes were due if you gave to a C4. The tax law required that their principal purpose had to be non-political, and no one was sure what principal purpose was. And so while they were being experimented with, another vehicle appeared. Actually, it was always there in plain sight, but clever tax lawyers, and a lot of the developments in this area are created by clever lawyers who look at this and say there must be a way. So clever lawyers in 2000 said, rather than this cumbersome C4 with its tax problems, why don't we use that other provision of the tax code called 527s, which are every political organization, we know they don't have to pay gift tax. If they're focused on federal elections, they have to register with the Federal Election Commission. If they're focused on a particular state election, they have to register with the states and disclose their donors because they're what we call PACs. But what happens if they're focused on politics at large, but not one particular level or one particular candidate? Isn't there a little gray area of arbitrage here where we can say we're a 527, so we don't have to worry about tax issues. We can spend all our money on politics. We don't have to disclose because 527s did not have to disclose their donors, and we don't have to register with the FEC or a state because our purpose isn't to influence a federal or a state election. Well, that worked for one cycle. It spectacularly worked in the spring of 2000 when I was John McCain's general counsel for his first presidential campaign, and we woke up 2 days before the Super Tuesday primaries to discover that a group called Republicans for Clean Air was running ads of belching smokestacks and pictures of John McCain in front of the belching smokestacks. And then it was running pictures of amber waves of grain and sunshine and pictures of George Bush. And it was saying McCain was out to pollute the environment. It was run by a 527, registered to a post office box. Nobody knew who it was. It actually took several days for people to find the treasurer who was registered to the post office box and camp outside her door. And eventually, 2 Texas billionaires turned up, who were Bush supporters, of course, and admitted that it was their 527. But after that election, the last time Congress has acted overwhelmingly on a disclosure issue, Congress passed a law requiring that donors to 527 be disclosed. The fine print is, because it's in the tax code, they have to be disclosed or pay a 35% tax as if it were a corporate tax. But that changed the situation for 527s, and we got back into the C4 world. We had McCain-Feingold, and McCain-Feingold came along to say, basically, rather than worrying about whether it's a C4 or a 527 or any of these other things, we think that ads run in the middle of an election should disclose their donors, that the donors of those people, those advertisements should be disclosed regardless of the form they take. And so that's actually what the McCain-Feingold statute says, that anyone who gives to an organization more than $1,000, which is spent to run an electioneering communication, something that mentions a candidate within 30 days of a primary or 60 of a general, has to disclose where the money came from. It's a pure disclosure statute. That got us through to Citizens United, and the court there took what was a disclosure case. This group said, we don't think we should have to disclose who gave us the money to create this movie, Hillary the movie, because it's not actually campaign speech, and thus we shouldn't have to disclose our donors. And the Supreme Court turned the case around. It said, why are we arguing about disclosure? You're a corporation. You are prohibited from spending money on this if we decide it's campaign speech. Is the prohibition constitutional? And so the court asked for a briefing on that, and the court ended up turning the case on its head. It said, you are not prohibited as a corporation from spending money on politics to elect or defeat a candidate, to issue public communications urging people to vote for or against a candidate, because corporations have full First Amendment rights, just as if you were an individual for purposes of campaigning. However, they said, you do have to disclose, and that part of the decision was 8-1. The court said, disclosure is important, and the way that Justice Kennedy restated that rationale is worth quoting. He said, with the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporation's interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether elected officials are in the pocket, in quotes, of so-called moneyed interests. The First Amendment protects political speech, and disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech of corporate entities in a proper way. This transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages. So that's Citizens United 4 years ago. Where are we today? The 2010 elections had a fair amount of speech, which was not disclosed. The 2012 presidential elections had an enormous amount, $400 million of speech where we knew the speech occurred, but we had no idea who was funding it. 2014, we're still counting, but in some of these races, you had tens of millions of dollars of undisclosed speech. So where did this come from, given what I've described as the history? How did we end up where we are? A short summary, because I'm probably out of time, waiting for the hook over here. But the short summary is a little-known Federal Election Commission regulation, which the Supreme Court did not refer to in 2010, and indeed my bet is did not know existed, but a regulation that had taken the McCain-Feingold law that said anyone who gives over $1,000 has to be disclosed if that money is used for political advertising in the election time period. The FEC added a phrase to the law, which Congress didn't put there, that said, if the money is given to the organization for the purpose of making an electioneering communication. Well, it turns out almost nobody actually gives money for the purpose of doing the communication. They give it to a group they know is going to do it, but they don't write on the check, this may only be used for an advertisement. Further, the FEC then said, well, and when we say for the purpose, we really mean for the purpose of a specific advertisement. So you'd have to say, that's the ad I want to run. So the FEC drove a truck through the disclosure regime at the same time that the IRS was overwhelmed dealing with applications for new 501c4s. And you've all read the newspaper articles, you're aware that there is, depending on how you phrase it, a scandal or something going on, or that did go on. But it basically has left the IRS on the sidelines with more C4s being formed all the time, very focused just on election activity, not disclosing their donors, and neither the FEC or the IRS in a position to do anything about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now I'll continue with Heather Gerken.
So I'm delighted to be here. I'm really glad. When I got Eitan's invitation, he really had me at ISPS because it's just an extraordinary organization, period, and it does this wonderful job of trying to help academics connect to the real world, which is, I can promise you, harder than you would think. And I didn't even know what a great panel I would be with at the time. So my job is to give you an overview of where current disclosure proposals stand, and then I'm going to talk to you about a new idea that's been getting a little bit of traction of late. Needless to say, I think my part of the program is the doom and gloom part, which is to talk about how nothing is happening, even though this seems very straightforward. So we have not made a lot of headway on the disclosure front in the wake of the Supreme Court's full-throated 8-to-1 endorsement of transparency in the much-loathed Citizens United. There are a few states that are getting some traction. Minnesota, for example, passed disclosure legislation aimed at corporate independent spenders. California is working on thinking about transparency for the initiative process. But at the federal level, the results have been, I think the easy phrase is depressing. Supporters of transparency have tried no fewer than 3 times in the last 3 years to pass the Disclose Act. And each time for repassage, the act has been shorn of its more controversial provisions in the hope of assuring passage. And each time, the slimmed-down version has not been able to slip through what few policymaking cracks still exist in Washington. Now, I don't think that will come as a surprise to anyone who is a Hill watcher. I mean, things have gotten so terrible in DC now that when I teach my con law students about the separation of powers, I begin, once upon a time, Congress passed laws. Now, the repeated failure to pass the Disclose Act might come as a surprise to someone who remembers the debates over McCain-Feingold, when one member after another of the Republican Party stood up and insisted that regulation was unnecessary provided we had adequate disclosure rules. And so you might think to yourself, based on that discussion, that if anything can garner bipartisan support in Washington, surely it is transparency. Unfortunately, Virginia, there is no Santa Claus, because this issue, like so many others in Washington, has become deeply politicized, thereby making it hard to find sponsors from both sides, let alone enough votes to pass legislation. The latest version of the Disclose Act does three main things. First, it redefines what constitutes an independent expenditure and pairs it with real-time reporting requirements, which are much more possible today than they were when McCain-Feingold was passed. Second, it extends special reporting requirements to certain kinds of organizations, just the ones you would guess: corporations, unions, tax-exempt charitable organizations, and now super PACs. And finally, it tries to address the problems associated with transfers among organizations, which is really a common strategy for hiding donors from the public view. It amounts to something like an institutional shell game. Now you can see why reformers cared the most about these reform provisions. Because for years, Congress and the FEC have been playing the regulatory equivalent of whack-a-mole with funders, as Trevor described. So whenever regulations make it hard for wealthy donors to fund politics, donors find another outlet to fund it. So Congress closes the soft money loophole for political parties, and money goes into issue ads and the 527s that Trevor described. 527s have now been displaced by super PACs and 501c4s. These organizations either didn't exist or at least weren't major players in early elections, but now they matter a lot. And reformers are very, very interested in trying to make them more transparent. That's why the Disclose Act sponsors maintain these provisions, even as they gave up a lot of the stuff that they'd managed to embed in earlier parts of the Act, including some very robust disclaimer rules, shareholder and lobbyist disclosure rules. Now, there are also some other proposals floating around the Hill. None seems to have a serious chance of passing. I will say many of them don't even have a single join on them. Now, for those of you thinking there must be another route to reform, it's worth noting that it's not just Congress that's been struggling on this front. So the FEC is often described as the institution that was built to fail. It has 3 Republican and 3 Democratic nominees, and they have been deadlocking in a way that they did not, for example, when Trevor was on the commission. Even the IRS, the poor IRS, has ventured into the elections arena, and it experienced a thumping so severe that you would have thought that House of Cards' Frank Underwood had arranged it. So as Trevor mentioned ever so briefly, the IRS has jurisdiction over the 501c4s, which are the crucial source of dark money at this moment. So these include things like Karl Rove's Crossroads GPS. And these so-called social welfare organizations spent a huge amount of money in the last few years. But unlike political parties, PACs, or super PACs, they aren't required to disclose their donors. Now, social welfare organizations are allowed to do that because, as Trevor noted, they are primarily supposed to be involved in non-campaign activity, but that vague standard left a lot of room for the lawyers to maneuver, and the IRS decided to sort of think about what that meant and to try to figure out if it ought to establish some more rules about that. It received 150,000 comments, more than for any other regulation in IRS history, and they were overwhelmingly negative. Both conservative and liberal groups insisted that the proposal would stifle legitimate social welfare activities and run afoul of the First Amendment. And some thought that while that was what the sort of protests were, I will say my quarrel with the IRS proposal was that even if it managed to tamp down on some 501c4 activities, it would not have made them more transparent. So the question is, where do we go from here in this depressing state of affairs? If there's any hope for reform, and I will just say that is a big if in Washington, then we need to find something that meets a few criteria. First, it has to be less controversial than the Disclose Act, and thus potentially something that could get passed because the Disclose Act has been a resounding failure so far. Second, given that stalemates in Congress aren't likely to go away anytime soon, it would be a proposal that helps us avoid the regulatory whack-a-mole game going forward, given that the odds of Congress returning to this issue anytime soon are pretty small. And finally, given I think that at this point in time, we are confined to what is pretty small gauge reform, we should imagine this is a here-to-there solution. And what do I mean by that? The here-to-there solution is something that may not be what we want at the end. It may not be the perfect reform strategy, but that it's going to help us get from here to there. It's a kind of small gauge reform that would make bigger and better reform possible. So recently, Wade Gibson, Webb Lyons, and I have proposed something that I think meets these three criteria. We've proposed that Congress require that any advertisement funded directly or indirectly by a group that does not disclose its donors acknowledge that fact. So this non-disclosure disclosure would be simple and truthful. It would say something like, this ad was paid for by X, which does not disclose the identity of its donors. And it would give voters, one would hope, a little bit of a shorthand for figuring out what to think about the ad. So the proposal has some virtues. It's constitutional, for one. Even the much reviled Citizens United decision upheld disclosure and disclaimers by an 8-1 vote. The fix is universal, for another. It doesn't make the mistake that we sometimes make in campaign finance, which is engage in the regulatory equivalent of whack-a-mole. So oftentimes we try to target the troublemakers du jour while leaving space for other organizations to emerge during the next campaign cycle. Our proposal targets, just like the early McCain-Feingold, targets ads and not organizations. That means it applies to any organization that fails to disclose, social welfare groups and labor unions, chambers of commerce, and private individuals. And better yet, it would apply to organizations that are built to funnel dark money in the future. It is also less intrusive than any of the proposals out there, which you might think might be helpful in trying to get it passed. It doesn't mandate that donors stand by their ad. It just mandates that donors who don't stand by their ad have the good grace to admit that fact. And it addresses the shell game being played as donors funnel money through one organization after another. Unless an organization can certify that all of the organizations funding it are transparent, it has to include the disclaimer. Finally, rather than attempting to sail against political headwinds, our proposal works with rather than against political incentives. We are not under any illusions that donors are going to stop seeking anonymous outlets for funding. But our proposal, we hope, would reduce the value of the anonymous outlets by giving people a reason to be skeptical of the ad, or at least denying the donors the anonymity that they crave. Donors are just going to be forced to choose then. They can fund organizations that disclose their donors, like the political parties or super PACs. Or if they want to keep their identity hidden, they can fund ads knowing that they might lose a little bit of their oomph in the eyes of cynical voters. Political incentives, one would hope, will push money into transparent organizations rather than away from them. So I don't want to overstate things because it is really hard to get reform passed these days. But if Congress is ever in the mood to do something, a non-disclosure disclosure rule seems like the right something to pass. It is less intrusive than the Disclose Act and thus more likely to garner the bipartisan support that it needs. It is a universal fix, one that regulates the ad, not the organization, and thus ensures that Congress and the FEC won't have to keep playing catch-up as political groups shift from one institutional form to another. Moreover, it harnesses politics to fix politics, working with political incentives instead of resisting them. In the long run, the hope would be that it will raise awareness of the dark money problem by making it clear to voters and at least making it clear to the media just how many ads are being secretly funded these days. That is nothing close to a full remedy for our alien system, but it is the type of modest reform that might make bigger and better reform possible. Thank you very much.
Okay. So Eitan asked me to provide a general overview of what we know about campaign finance from the research, and this was a very bracing exercise for me because as I considered the main findings, I began to realize that some of the same conclusions reached almost 100 years ago appear repeated in today's research. And back then, a scholar at Wellesley, Louise Overecker, wrote a book called Money and Politics, which looked at the elections in the 1920s and 30s. Her work remained the scholarly consensus on campaign finance. And she served up her findings in response to reforms pushed by progressives at the turn of the century. Today, political scientists appear to be doing the same things in response to progressive small p who desire additional reforms in the mold of large P progressives. So here's the scholarly consensus about camp finance. I'll go through the list, which dates back to Overacker. I borrow heavily from Tom Mann's excellent essay on the subject and perspectives. First, more money is needed in campaigns, not less. So this is what scholars tend to say. Spending limits tend to protect incumbents. Contribution limits are easy to get around and create other problems, like weak disclosure. Money does not corrupt the process. Now, I know we political scientists sound a little bit like Chico Marx and Duck Soup saying, you know, who are you going to believe, me, your own eyes? So anyway, that's something that's controversial. Public financing is a positive and partial solution to problems in a system, and effective disclosure can promote an accountable marketplace in campaign finance. So the beauty of this list, actually, is it shows that political scientists have been almost completely ignored for the past 100 years. And it shows the power of our profession. Let me take each of these in turn. First, money is needed, more money is needed in campaign, not less. A common refrain in editorials is that the election is awash in money. Too much, a shameful amount. Well, research actually casts doubt on whether there's too much here, particularly for legislative elections where news coverage isn't so good. Studies show that increased campaign spending actually creates better informed voters. And you know what? Voters remember ads, especially the negative ones. Second, it's not necessarily true that things have gotten worse over time. Overacker and others today have showed that the amount of money in elections has not really changed, certainly not relative to other types of spending in society. For example, if you look at campaign spending relative to the size of our economy, it hasn't changed hardly. Nations with large economies spend more on politics just like they spend more on other stuff. Now, a chief problem, I would say, is that a lot of this spending is wasted because parties and candidates, they don't spread the money around races. They just concentrate in just a few. And yes, then the dynamic becomes an arms race, and I agree that's a problem. But turning down the spigot is unlikely to improve the situation. It might even make elections worse. Second point is related. Spending limits tend to protect incumbents. Why is that? Because incumbents start with huge name recognition advantages. And they have other resources at their disposal to let voters know who they are. Spending limits are no longer allowed due to the Buckley v. Vallejo decision in the 70s, but before that, they were very much allowed. Gary Jacobson has shown that challengers tend to benefit from additional spending compared to incumbents. And now others have challenged this view, but it seems clear that you need sufficient money to do well. Now the question is how much and what can be done to close the gap between candidates. And I think another real problem that I'm concerned with here is that the amount of time candidates spend raising money is just unbelievable. It's all out of proportion to how much the value of money is in elections, at least their election. There's a law of diminishing returns. But the candidates are obsessed with developing war chess. 3, contribution limits are easy to get around. I don't need to show much research here. Trevor just talked about it. Heather just talked about it. There was a brief period after the 74 reforms when things actually seemed to work. But before that, when there were spending limits, contribution limits, we had independent candidate citizen committees to elect Eisenhower or other politicians. Today, of course, we have leadership PACs, super PACs, every type of PAC, you name it. Here's something to think about with contribution limits. Some recent research shows that it might be pushing the parties to polarize. This fellow at BYU, Michael Barber's done research showing that candidates today rely more on individual contributions than ever, more than they rely on PACs. Sounds good, right? Well, one problem is individual donors are very polarized, okay? PACs are not. So here's the deal with the devil. If you limit PAC donations, you get polarized politics, according to this research. But if you remove PAC limits, you basically endorse a system where corporate influence is heavy in politics. So where are you going to come down? There are trade-offs here. Fourth, money does not corrupt the policy process. This is the most controversial finding by far, not universally embraced by scholars, obviously. Almost every study of roll call votes shows that there's no relationship between contributions and how that member votes once you control for other factors. Now, research acknowledges money works in other, more subtle ways. Money buys effort in committees. The little things that happen before a bill reaches the floor. If anything, I would argue money buys the status quo, which is pretty simple in our system of separation of powers. Do campaign finance laws matter at all in reducing corruption? I mean, this is hard to measure, corruption. It really is. David has made some heroic efforts at this. But I haven't seen much effort here, much evidence. One thing seems certain. The public certainly thinks the money nexus, regardless of the rules, is corrupting. And there's no relationship, as far as we can tell, between laws and public trust. In fact, when the parties were using or abusing soft money, public trust in institutions was on the rise. Very paradoxical. So, again, none of this is to say that money has no impact, but I think it does. But it comes much earlier in the process, in the decisions about who gets to run, what they stand for, and how well they actually do. 5, public financing is good for the system. I won't say much here. The goal is to make candidates less reliant on private money, make the system fair and competitive. Lots of support in the political science community for this. We need more work here because, first of all, there's not much evidence that public financing helps new candidates or the legislative process. The problem with most schemes that are proposed by advocates is they're just not generous enough, and then they cut off the supply of private money. That's just not feasible, and it creates all sorts of weird problems. Here in Connecticut, you see what's happening. I just read in the paper, Kennedy, one of the Kennedys ran for state senate. He said he's going to limit himself to public funds. Of course he's going to get private money funneled through the parties. That's obvious. This brings me to disclosure. I know David's going to touch some stuff here. Disclosure is sacrosanct as a policy tool, but now it's receiving more nuanced scrutiny. Other forms of regulation are controversial. This is less so for political science. It seems more like a pure good if it could help voters see who's behind the curtain, holding politicians accountable, maybe preventing corruption. So scholars are starting to focus on good questions. What does disclosure really accomplish? I mean, what are the costs? We haven't looked into that. How do intermediaries like the press or interest groups actually use this information? Is it good? Do voters care? Does it affect their vote? I know that there's some research being done by scholars at the Wesleyan Media Project that suggests, yes, voters become more skeptical when they see who's funding these candidates. But the problem is voters are ignorant. They don't look at the information or they don't have it. With other regulations on shaky legs, you're going to see a lot more research in this area. There's some new proposals. I like Heather's idea. I might favor a more incentive-based policy, like giving discounts to advertising for organizations that actually fully disclose. So you pay a premium for hiding your donors, for not being transparent. I would also raise, this is controversial, but I would raise significantly the limits on giving candidates and parties so money flows through them rather than non-transparent groups. Bruce Kane has suggested semi-disclosure where you don't actually publish the name of the person giving the money, but like census data, what demographics, where they are, what industries, things like that. Actually, the one I like the best is The Onion proposed that, I was going to say Ackerman and Ayers think we should have total anonymity. This is an interesting piece of research. So given that disclosure has become the last stand, we're going to have more scrutiny. We'd like to know what would happen if we didn't have disclosure. Would politics become more nasty as it becomes more anonymous? Would the wealthy who are now who might be reluctant to give money, start pouring money in? People who are on the sidelines. I think Doug Spencer, who's here today, some of his work suggests maybe not, maybe under some conditions it will. Finally, more broadly, I personally think we need to move away from this old paradigm of populist kind of big P progressive reforms, these kind of command and control sets. I don't think we're getting much bang for the buck for them, and I think it's creating a lot of distortions that make things worse. So with that, I think it's time to think about a new approach. Thanks.
David Primo.
Well, I want to thank you, Eitan, for inviting me here to participate. I'm thrilled to see that so many of you turned out for this discussion of disclosure. And to be honest, what's remarkable about this turnout is that until a few years ago, this wasn't really an issue that anybody was really debating. Certainly not in political science. There really didn't seem to be much to argue about. It was obvious to many that When individuals or corporations spend money on politics, the public ought to know. This is a policy, we were told, that had lots of benefits. The courts told us, so it must be true, right? The informational rationale, the anti-corruption rationale that Trevor mentioned. So disclosure is going to reduce corruption. It's going to provide voters with information to make better decisions. And it's going to hold corporations and other groups accountable for their speech. And that's what reformers claimed then and continue to claim now. But as Ray alluded to, we're starting to see a lot more research in political science now that's actually taking these claims seriously. These are claims that had previously been treated as just assumed truths. They're just obvious truths about the world. But in fact, they are actually empirically testable claims. And we're starting to see in the research that I'm going to talk about, some of which I've done, and some of which actually Ray's done, and I'll talk about that as well, that at best, the purported benefits of disclosure may not be as significant as reformers have claimed, and the costs may actually be very real and very damaging to the democratic process. And I want to conclude my remarks by sort of talking about what future directions for research might look like, and also raise a couple of questions that I hope will serve as the basis for discussion and for Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. So there's been a lot of research on disclosure in recent years. I'm going to put aside two big categories of research, and that's observational research, so just looking at these big data sets, and survey-based studies. And instead, I want to focus on an area that is near and dear to the hearts of the political scientists here at Yale, and that's experiments. So it's a little risky to talk about experiments at Yale because field experiments, one of the types of experiments I'm going to talk about, were actually first done in political science in large degree here at Yale. And sort of they allow us to change policy, manipulate policy in a way that helps us get at what the effects of these policies are. And what's important about this, what's important about experiments and why I think they're so valuable is that, as Heather alluded to, we're not actually seeing a lot of movement in Congress. We're not actually seeing a lot of movement in the states. There isn't a ton of variation in disclosure laws that comes to us from politicians. So why not create that variation in the lab? So I'm going to talk about three kinds of experiments: field experiments, survey experiments, of which online experiments are one type, and lastly, natural experiments. I'm talking about a little bit of research in each and show you why I think it's relevant to disclosure. So field experiments are actually really controversial and in the news right now. How many people have heard about the Montana situation? All right, so big scandal. Political scientists at Dartmouth and Stanford had the nerve, the temerity, to send voters information about judges running for office. And Montana said, "How dare you get in the middle of our politics? Stay out of our elections." They disclosed that they were doing a study. But it was in small print, and they used the Montana state seal. So field experiments are actually really risky, it turns out. But what's the goal of a field experiment? Well, the goal of a field experiment is to take the real world and subject it to manipulation. So it's like an in-lab experiment, but you're actually varying the treatment you give to individuals. So let me give you an example of a real field experiment that's been done in campaign finance disclosure. You go to say you pick a set of voters, and you randomly do nothing to one set, that's your control group. You send another set a letter saying that there are these laws out there about campaign contributions and disclosure. Here's what they are. And you send another group a letter that says, hey, you know, people in your neighborhood give money to candidates, and here's how much they've given, and here's which candidates they've given to. And when you do that, it turns out that the people who get information that people of the opposite party have given to candidates are less likely to make a campaign contribution. So one implication to draw from that is that you might be worried all of a sudden when you get this letter that people are going to find out that you've given to a candidate and you're not going to be liked by your neighbors anymore. That's one potential problem. And so you're less likely to contribute. And this is actually supported by some work that Ray has done, a survey experiment that Ray has done, showing that you find a similar effect when you manipulate certain aspects of a survey, where again people are going to get information that their contributions are going to be disclosed publicly. So this sort of suggests that there are these participatory costs of disclosure. That this is not simply an all-benefit, no-cost situation, as Trevor alluded to it at the beginning of the event. So that's the cost side, and we can certainly talk more about that in Q&A. What about the informational side of disclosure? Well, there I think survey experiments can be particularly useful. So there's this claim that, of course, it's obvious, right, that the more information you give to voters about who's giving, or in the case of Heather's a really interesting proposal that's definitely worth discussing further, who's not telling you that they're giving, you can use a survey experiment to sort of see whether that information is actually helpful. And so there's been one survey experiment, that's been done that's shown that if voters know really nothing about a candidate, and then all of a sudden you tell them who gave to that candidate, they're going to be better able to identify where that candidate lies in the ideological spectrum. So if you know nothing about a candidate, you know they get a lot of money from unions, chances are they're a Democrat. If you know nothing else about a candidate, and you know they get a lot of money from oil companies, chances are they're a Republican. Okay? But I argue in my work that that's not the right question to ask. That what we want to ask is whether or not the information disclosure provides is useful to voters at the margin. In other words, there's a lot of information out there in the world. Right? There's this thing called the internet. Right? It has a lot of data about candidates. And so once you take into account all the information voters have, does knowing that this candidate got money from unions really tell you anything useful? And the research I've done in ballot measures suggests that it does not. So what about advertisements? So Connor Dowling and Amber Wachowski, who had the good taste to be fellows here at ISPS for a year or two, have done some really interesting work, survey experiment work, looking at how voters perceive attack ads. And they found that voters discount attack ads when the sources of funds are disclosed in detail. So if a funder has to list the top 3 or 4 or 5 contributors to that organization, you're less likely to trust the attack ad. Or if voters, or if the ad says that the candidate, the organization doesn't disclose its donors, this is exactly the scenario that Heather discussed, voters are also less likely to trust the source of the ad, and they're more likely to be sympathetic to the candidate that's attacked. And I'm going to come back to sort of the implications of that, but I think that's some really interesting work that's being done. So that's field experiments and survey experiments. A third kind of experiment, now we're not going to go out and manipulate the world. We're going to let the politicians do it for us. And so that's the world of natural experiments, where you take advantage of this variation that occurs in the world naturally. And I've done this in a recent paper with a co-author where we looked at a change in United Kingdom law regarding corporate disclosure and how much corporations had to disclose about their political activities. This is another area where it's claimed that it's obvious that shareholders benefit from having corporations disclose who gives money. After all, how are you going to hold managers accountable if corporations don't have to tell shareholders exactly what they do? Well, it turns out that when corporations are forced to do this, their stock is hurt. The shareholders actually don't benefit from this. And part of the reason is that you can't just disclose to shareholders, right? You're disclosing to the world, which means you're disclosing to activists who want to go after the corporation. And so this sort of speaks to how there are these trade-offs between benefits and costs in disclosure. Okay, so there are a lot of other studies I can talk about, but I really want to get to the Q&A and the discussion because I think that's going to be really, I hope it's going to be really interesting. But I want to just sort of close with sort of the question that motivates this panel, and that's where should we go from here? I think it's clear from my review of the literature, at least, that there is no well-developed body of evidence showing that disclosure laws have significant benefits and have virtually no cost, as is often claimed by reformers. And so I think it's worth sort of probing deeper and seeing whether maybe with enough research we can discover that these effects do exist. So on the question of information, I think one important next step is to actually ask in more detail whether voters are actually better off with this information. So again, it's often assumed that this is just going to be the case. But again, I don't think that it's necessarily obvious. So think about something that's been a hot topic in the world of disclosure, and that is disclosing calorie counts on menus. Again, something else we're told was just obviously going to help people make better decisions when they go to a restaurant. You go up to the restaurant on the big board, you see the calorie counts, you say, my God, that's a tuna sandwich. That is not healthy at all. I'm not going to get that. I was bamboozled by these people telling me it was a healthy tuna sandwich. Well, turns out that evidence is very mixed that calorie counts that are mandated actually help people make better decisions. And is democracy actually better off with greater transparency? I think that's the fundamental question. Difficult question to ask, not a popular question to ask, but I think an important one to ask. So let me give you an example of another sort of result that came out of Dowling and Wachowski's work. they found that voters were very distrustful of messages from out-of-state voters. And if, again, the goal is to have better informed voters, voters who are more educated about issues, is playing on the fact that voters are biased against out-of-state messages, sort of maybe requiring that to be disclosed, as some might hope, because these are the corporate interests, if you will, that are coming into a campaign. Right? Is that actually making our democracy better to play on people's biases? Or, is it, playing on people, if people are going to discount an ad because they know who paid for it, rather than looking at the content of the ad? Again, isn't that biasing people? And is that actually producing better, higher quality decision-making among voters? And with that, I want to close with a final comment that's going to tie into work that Ray has done and to Trevor's appearances on the Colbert Report. And that's the media. So part of how transparency is going to have an impact is going to be filtered through the media. Because I suspect, if I ask for a show of hands, not many of you will have gone onto the FEC's website and looked at the actual campaign disclosure forms. Right? Maybe you've gone on the Center for Responsive Politics website, right, and looked at summaries. But somebody's doing that distilling for you. And you might think, well, I read the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, I'm an educated voter, I know what's going on with campaign finance. Well, it turns out that people who read elite news sources actually know less about campaign finance than people who do not. That was work that was done a few years back. And right, it turns out that, perhaps thanks to Trevor, people who view and watch the Colbert Report know more about transparency than people who look at other media sources. So the solution to our problems, right, is to have Trevor discuss transparency more often on the Colbert Report and make people watch it. But seriously, right, there is this issue of the media is going to be filtering this. And by and large, they don't do a very good job of actually conveying campaign finance information. So that's sort of another set of problems that I think we need to deal with. And with that, I want to stop so that we have time for a Q&A.
Thank you all. We have an embarrassment of riches of wonderful presentations and wonderful ideas. So we are going to have, as you see, we're setting up microphones to either side. And so if you have a question for one or more of the panelists, please come to the microphone and we can get started. So please make your way to microphones if you have a question. Maybe as you do, I will ask a first question that is to all of you. And that is a question about thinking about this problem and separating it into big races and big donors versus everything else. So we know a lot of the money, most of the money is happening in these big elections. We know in those elections there's a lot of parity. Generally there's parity in terms of money coming on the Democratic side and the Republican side. We also know that in the big races is where some of the big famous Koch brother type donors are activated. But what worries people a lot, I think, is what happens in little races, both because in little races where there's, as Ray said, not a lot of information, there might be more potential for a really one-sided financial contribution that can tip things. And also in these little elections, there might be a lot more small actors, mom and pop shops that want to try to convince the electorate that, hey, this regulation proposed by this candidate is bad for our businesses, and that has a slightly different flavor than kind of large-scale corporate sponsorship of money. And so I wanted to know whether any of your views are kind of adjusted, or what kind of adjustments we have in policy and law and political science for thinking about small scale versus large scale.
I think there's an enormous difference between the marquee races, the Obama-Romney race, and local races for, let's say, retention of judges or the county council. And Ray flagged this as well. I think the amount of money that is spent in a presidential race, first of all, is significant. But it parallels the press coverage and the so-called free media, so that when people choose to go to the polls or not, you would have to truly have slept through an election cycle not to know there was a presidential election, not to know the candidates, and not to have some opinion of them. That is absolutely the opposite of what you're going to find in races down the ballot. where you go in and you think, gosh, I didn't even know that was happening this year. I didn't realize this was the cycle for whatever that position is. I've never heard of any of these judges I'm being asked whether to retain or not. So I agree that I think there is a dearth of, I'm not sure if it's spending, but certainly a dearth of information, because it's hard to break through the noise level, as well as not having the money to dominate the airwaves. You can't get through the press attention at a smaller local level. And we're a democracy that has far more political activity than many other democracies do. There are countries that go to the polls once every 5 years. They elect their local member of parliament and maybe the mayor. And then parliament elects the prime minister. In a parliamentary system, you're just voting for one party. But it's really simple. Here, we do voting all the time. We have on-year and off-year elections. We have the peculiarities of odd-year elections. We have local elections on different dates than national elections. It makes it very hard to break through.
Yeah, I'd say there are three ways in which it's true. So one, as Trevor mentioned, it's judicial elections and local elections. Often they're also nonpartisan elections, so they don't have the important heuristic that voters often need to sort, which is the D or R, Democrat or Republican. So that makes it even more troubling. Second is primaries, where also voters are not guided by heuristic, and so and it's a very low turnout. So money is more important in those elections in terms of moving turnout and things like that. So that matters quite a bit. And the other place I'll just say small scale versus large scale, and this just really goes to some of the things. I think there's an emerging consensus among law professors that the full scale transparency for donors above $200 is not necessary. The money that you want to be able to trace is the big money. And that the only people who use the voter databases that tell you for people with small amounts of money are their neighbors, their students. I see some of my students in the room. Like, all my students know who donated where on their faculty. So that's not actually, as interesting as that might seem, that is not a helpful heuristic. What you need to know is where the big money goes. And so there's lots of ways in which thinking about small and large is very helpful in this debate.
I think the answer, I'll pass. That was answered very well by both of you.
I just wanted to add one. I agree that certainly there is a difference between small and large donors in lots of respects. On the other hand, if to the extent that we're talking about constitutional issues or speech issues, I'm not sure that because you're spending a lot of money, all of a sudden you have less of a claim to any particular right than you did if you're spending less money. On the other hand, you could make the argument that the concerns you might have about the speech are more significant the greater the amount of money that's spent. But if you look at some ballot measures that we've seen in this year, corporations and other interests spent millions of dollars in these elections, and they lost. So the concern that
except the ones they won.
Except the ones they won, but they do lose. So the notion that corporations are just going to come in these local elections and spend millions of dollars and get their way just isn't the case. Certainly, nobody's going to argue that money doesn't help get a message across. But especially in a local election, there are going to be plenty of opportunities for citizen groups and others to get together and get their message out.
But this is just one place. The people who mostly don't read political science are incumbents. So the one thing that you really notice whenever you talk to these guys is you tell them, like, the odds of you not being elected next year are the odds of being dismissed from the Politburo. It's very, very low likelihood. They are terrified, and you can tell them, look, lots of people, even when a big corporate interest goes up against them with a big war chest, they don't need a war chest that big. They're incumbents. They're going to do just fine. They don't believe that either. So part of it is not the question of what actually happens on Election Day. Part of it is what they think is going to happen, and they don't read you guys enough. If they did, they'd be calmer about it, and I think less likely to react in the way that they do.
Great. Let's get some questions here. Should we go right here?
Yes, hi. Thank you for coming here. It's very enlightening. I work with a group of students, some at Yale and some at Harvard, Columbia, and other colleges, on this and campaign finance issues. And we have somewhat come to the conclusion that any chance of Congress passing any kind of significant legislation in this area is remote because of what you all know, polarization, et cetera, and gridlock, and that perhaps a focus more should be on the agencies that are regulating and enforcing existing laws, such as the IRS right now in the 501c4 issue. And the IRS does have the power, I believe, to create significant regulations that would require disclosure. So my question to you is, why shouldn't we focus on the IRS? Why shouldn't people like you and also citizens make their opinions known and try to influence these agencies to pass enforceable regulations?
I mean, I think it's good to focus on the enforcement agencies, some of which are not doing a great job, but I really worry about the IRS being involved in any of this, to be frank. I mean, it seems like it's coming to their lap, but they are not competent to deal with political issues, in my opinion. It's really hurting. Whatever you think about what happened with the scandal, whatever, it's hurting their reputation. And I'd like to see that go back to its proper place at the Federal Election Commission. That's my feeling.
But they are involved.
So. Right, but I don't think we should promote the IRS as being a major enforcer of money in politics. The lawyers might have a different view on this, but...
No, I mean, I don't disagree at all. The IRS is not set up to deal with this. The 501c4s and all of these nonprofits were never thought of in a million years as being political actors. They're nonprofits under the tax code with this tax status. Political activity was over at the FEC or at the state level. But as I explained, what's happened is that clever people who are looking for ways through the system have said that's an advantage. We'll avoid the FEC and the state agencies, and we'll fire at the IRS because they don't pay attention to this stuff. So then the IRS gets put in a position where it's happening on their watch. They have a law that the law actually says for C4s that your sole purpose has to be social welfare, and you may not engage in political activity. But the IRS decided in the 50s that that was a little draconian, and if you just did a little political stuff, you shouldn't lose your tax exemption for a C4, so they said your primary purpose has to be social welfare. So now we argue over what is primary purpose, what counts as an election expenditure, all the rest of it. I mean, I don't know how to get it out of the IRS except to say, if you engage in any political activity, you have to report to the FEC. The problem there is that then you have to deal with your question, which is, so what do you do about an agency that was set up to require a majority to do anything? 4 votes to take any action, and functionally 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. For a long time, when I was there, I think we had 1 deadlock in the 5 years I was there. That was, I can basically say, by accident. Now, most major matters are deadlocked 3-3, not necessarily because it's a Republican versus Democratic issue in terms of who gets fined, but on the philosophy of whether there ought to be disclosure, whether the law should require disclosure of the sorts of things McCain-Feingold says, how far the reach of the FEC should go. And those are difficult issues. But when an agency is splitting 3-3 and literally unable to act legally, it's then sort of tough to say, well, take it out of the IRS and give it to the FEC because it won't be done there either.
Exactly.
Thank you for your question. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Okay.
So thank you so much for the excellent discussion so far. I have a very simple question. I'm curious, what happened to the Republican Party in the 10 years after McCain-Feingold? Why did they change their position on disclosure?
I think, Trevor, you might be the only Republican up here, but...
All right. It's an example, I think, of practical politics. First of all, the party hasn't officially changed its position on disclosure. It was against, the majority of the party was against McCain-Feingold in the first place. And though it was bipartisan in name and fact, the majority of Republicans in both houses voted against it. And the party then sued, and Bush signed it basically with a gun to his head. So that law was seen as hurting Republicans. I'm not at all convinced it did, but what it led to was a world where, particularly post-Citizens United, you had much larger expenditures by these so-called outside groups than ever before. You had a liberation of corporations and chambers of commerce and other groups, but they had the concern, which has been noted on this panel, which is the shareholders may not like it. Our customers may not like it. Our employees are both Republicans and Democrats. They may not like it. So there was, for the first time, sort of the opposite of what Justice Kennedy thought, which is we're going to have corporate spending, but it's going to be fully disclosed. We had the legal ability to spend money out of corporations, but a reputational risk to them if it was, in fact, disclosed. And you had these vehicles. You have the C4s, the C6s, where the money could be spent and not disclosed. So I think what's happened is that the corporate money has ended up disproportionately in vehicles that don't disclose. So from a Republican Party perspective, you're saying we're finally able to compete with labor unions, which always spent a lot of money on turning out their own members, and corporations didn't have members they could turn out. Now we're allowed to spend it, but if we have disclosure, and the Chamber of Commerce has been very frank about it, if you require disclosure, we won't be able to raise the money to spend to elect a Republican Senate, is what they said back in 2010 when the debate was about Citizens United and requiring the Disclose Act. So I think it's become practical politics. At the moment, the perception is, and this is borne out in the numbers I've seen in this last election, the spending was about even amongst the outside groups between Republicans and Democrats, but it was very uneven in terms of who was disclosing and who not. The Democratic groups tended to be super PACs that disclosed. The Republican spending tended to lean into the non-disclosing C4s, C6s. So I think what's happened is that it's all politics is local. This is not an abstract debate. It becomes very difficult to talk about it when the perception is one party will be hurt or benefited by requiring disclosure we don't have practically at the moment.
It's also just a sign of how much the law has dramatically shifted in the last few years in a deregulatory fashion. So the reason why it was kind of a gimme to say disclosure and disclaimers, because that's not where the fight was. I mean, the law was much more on the regulatory side. And so if you were going to put your shoulder to the wheel, you'd fight about these other issues. Now, I mean, disclosure and disclaimer are pretty, I mean, since I'm teaching election law, I thought about only teaching disclosures and disclaimers because as far as I can tell, they may be the only thing that's constitutional anymore. So that's where the shift has gone. And so unsurprisingly, politics have followed where the regulatory side is.
Great. So in Citizens United, Clarence Thomas voiced a very unpopular dissent, like the 1-8 dissent, that full disclosure could lead to intimidation and coercion, and that could lead to more undemocratic processes. And it seems like David, if I may call you David, has talked about when people see their neighbors not contributing to campaigns, it has a discourages participation in expressing their own speech through donating. And given that political scientists have had a hard time proving corruption and the benefits of full disclosure being there's a anti-corruption intent and there's a information intent, and it seems that David has also, I don't know if he did the research, but there's been research that shows that on the margin, full disclosure doesn't actually have this beneficial effect of providing information to voters. On the margin, does that give any more weight to Clarence Thomas's argument that there is this coercion and that it could lead to more undemocratic processes?
I do see lots of concerns about disclosure being used as a tool to attack rather than to educate. Now, you could make the argument, well, if Scalia made, if you want to have an opinion, you should stand behind that opinion. But on the other hand, if you fear that you're going to be ostracized by your neighbors, maybe you don't want to make a strong stand on a political issue. If your social well-being is more important to you, or I'm trying not to focus too much on threats of violence and so on, because I do think those are exceedingly rare. But on the other hand, we do need to be, I think, before we even get to cost, we need to ask, are there actually benefits here? And that's been the thing that I think there have been more assumptions about. I think even the supporters of disclosure have acknowledged that there could be potential costs, but they've been downplayed because the benefits are thought to be so great. But I do think that there is a concern, especially in terms of targeting corporations. Now, I suspect a lot of people in this room are not feel bad for the corporations. They are being put upon because people are going to go after them. But corporations need to be participating in the political process because politicians want to regulate them. Right? It's not that corporations are, free to do whatever they want and they're trying to somehow interject themselves into the political process. A CEO that isn't aware of what's going on in politics is going to be in a whole lot of trouble. And so the notion that you're going to create a roadmap essentially for activists to target the corporation just seems to me to be sort of problematic. So I don't think Thomas is talking about corporations so much in his decision, but I think that is certainly an implication of his dissent.
Okay, but now we just need to talk about the First Amendment for just 1 minute. So I completely take the point about the way good governance groups tend to overestimate the benefits. I mean, it happens in every regulatory arena. They want the attention of policymakers. They promise more than they can deliver. But on the cost side, this is where the rhetoric has just gotten completely overblown. So first of all, politics ain't beanbag. And if there are real and genuine threats of violence, there is an exception that you can apply for, which groups do, if there's a genuine threat. But consumer boycotts is not the kind of threat that the First Amendment recognizes. If you just remember back, so right now the cases that is being cited is a storied civil rights case where people were being lynched, right, for their association with civil rights causes. That during the civil rights movement, let's remember, consumer boycotts were a tool of dissenters, right? They are a gloried and storied First Amendment tradition. And so it is true that corporations may get boycotted, but that is what the First Amendment contemplates that will happen. I mean, we've always boycotted store owners for what they said when they were racist. So I don't want to, on the cost side, the First Amendment does have, and our traditions do have something to say about those costs. And so everyone would agree violence, everyone agrees intimidation, but the rest of it, it's not clear that the First Amendment, the First Amendment embodies a normative judgment about what costs are acceptable, and it cannot be, if consumer boycotts are a problem, then the First Amendment has been making a mistake for a century.
I'm not saying that consumer boycotts are in any way sort of problematic from a First Amendment perspective, but the argument that corporations should have to facilitate consumer boycotts, that I sort of take, that I think is more problematic.
Well, but Justice Kennedy says that it's important for us to know who the donor is and what the position is. So, I mean, how...
That's what Justice... I'm not... Justice Kennedy can say what he likes. Yeah. I think he's wrong.
But why should it be invisible? If they want to spend the money and it's important in their corporate interest, let them say it and let their consumers tell them whether they think that's a good idea or not.
Let me take a different approach to this discussion. I think it's a great discussion in the question. And a nice word for Justice Kennedy here. He clearly, I believe, he didn't envision what's happened in the only 4 years since Citizens United, because there weren't super PACs when the Supreme Court issued Citizens United, which means they were talking about corporations speaking in their own names. And so they were assuming a form of political discourse, which is almost universally now not happening. If you go back to the Bellotti case I mentioned, where the Supreme Court said it overturned a Massachusetts law that prohibited corporations from spending money in ballot initiatives. There was a ballot initiative. It was going to raise the corporate tax rate. The First National Bank of Boston said, we care about this issue. We ought to be able to discuss it. The Supreme Court agreed and said there's no danger of corruption here. You're directly implicated by this, so you can spend money on the ballot initiative. But they were going to spend money to talk about whether taxes should be raised in Massachusetts, on them, on other corporations, what the business climate was. So they were going to, in my ivory tower view of things, they were going to actually contribute to better inform voters by having a discussion about economic policy and whether it was a good thing to raise taxes or not. That's what I think Justice Kennedy thought we were going to get out of Citizens United is corporations participating, and he assumed it would be directly and they'd be visible. So they talk about issues, politics, policies, how it affected them, what voters should do about tax issues or whatever else. But instead, we got this diversion to corporations giving to groups that did not disclose donors, who do not, by and large, spend their money talking about the issues that actually affect the corporation. It isn't that you see a lot of direct discussions about tax policy. Instead, the money goes into a group which hires political consultants who say, our polling says the best issue is something else entirely, and it all gets spent on negative ads. And the only bone I would pick with some of what Ray said is the idea that negative ads produce better educated voters. It depends on what the ad's about. If it's actually about is our healthcare system better or worse under Obama, that may be a very useful discussion. But when it turns out to be, did somebody pay their taxes 30 years ago? Did they vote 3 elections ago? Did they stop beating their spouse? All the sorts of stuff that a lot of these negative ads turn out to be about. To me, the corporation's voice is not being heard. The issues they care about are not being discussed. And I think our political discourse is actually worsened, not better, by encouraging these sorts of negative ads. And those statistics will show that it is more likely that the money will be used for negative ads if you don't have to say who it's coming from, because then you're not accountable. That is why you will see that candidates are more likely to run balanced ads, but an outside group that the studies now are showing has more credibility because you don't know who it is, so you think it's some sort of nonpartisan group, is going to run more negative ads.
Real quick, I mean, you make the distinction seem very simple, but it's not. I think it's not that simple. Who's representing the corporation? I'm actually not sympathetic to the corporation's plight, to be honest with you. But but I am. What I am concerned about is people average participation. What I've noticed in some of my research is people who are cross-pressured, live in communities next to a Republican, they're a Democrat. Maybe their neighbor's their boss. Their boss finds out they gave money to a candidate or sign a petition. The boss can do it with one click. Say, "Oh, Jane, what is she doing? Wow, she's really bizarre." I mean, those types of things have a chilling effect, and we're still trying to find out. So what do you end up with? You end up with people who feel passionate, So they're gonna give no matter what. But the people we want to draw people in who are not connected to politics yet. And I'm afraid that some of this disclosure of small donors and petition signers is not the way to do that.
Great question.
Thank you. Well, the gentleman before me stole a lot of my question. In listening to political scientists, I kept saying to myself, I love full disclosure. I would love to know who everybody is that's giving. But the concurrent thought in my head is risk. In every campaign, in every administration that I can remember, I'm 58 years old, at some point somebody got targeted by the IRS. Whether or not you believe it started, where it started, there's a gentleman in Idaho, I think his name was Romer, gave a lot of money, all of a sudden sort of came out politically and gave a lot of money, and he was raked through the coals by the IRS. Look at the district attorney in Milwaukee. I don't think, while it's not violent, I don't think any of those people that got a visit from the Wisconsin State Police in the middle of the night thought it was very funny. And I worry about the IRS. I worry about enthusiastic district attorneys. When you put your name out there, I mean, all my neighbors are great. I don't worry about my neighbors. They're all professors at Yale anyway, so I don't have to worry. I worry about the one that runs the anatomy department at the medical school. But I don't worry about my neighbors. But what I would worry about if I had $250,000 to drop on a campaign tomorrow wouldn't be any of my neighbors. It might be the Attorney General in the state of Connecticut. It might be the District Attorney for the County of New Haven. It might be somebody like that just decided that they wanted to make my life hell.
Yeah, just so we've litigated now 2 of these cases. One involving disclosure, both the case involving Prop 8 disclosure and then the case involving a disclosure of people who sign petitions. And when you go into a court of law and actually have to produce evidence of these kinds of things, what you discover is that the kinds of things that people are experiencing, sometimes their neighbor knocks on their door and says, you know, I think we should talk about gay rights. And so that's uncomfortable, but that is not the kind of thing that I think we should be worried about. People lose their signs, sometimes their political signs on their lawn, but anyone who's been in politics and elections knows that happens pretty routinely. But so far, there's been no evidence. And if there is evidence of a state official using these things in
what would you say to the people who got a visit from the Wisconsin State Police, who were coordinating information for Walker, who Chisholm decided to go after? I mean, what do you say to those people?
Oh, do you want to
I actually, yeah, I mean, I ultimately, I think that that if there was malfeasance there, I think it will eventually come out. So when the IRS is a little bit trickier because the IRS scheme is a little bit trickier. But in terms of the Wisconsin case, I mean, I think that to the extent that there was malfeasance, it will eventually come out, and that if elected officials or if prosecutors are acting inappropriately, I have enough faith in the U.S. system of government that they're going to be held accountable. So I'm more concerned about sort of the fear that again, as Ray said, the average citizen thinks that they're not going to be able to get involved, shouldn't get involved in the political process because now there are now these tools that the Sunlight Foundation has created that when you get an email, you can find out, like automatically figure out who this person who's sending you the email, who they've given to. And it's kind of a weird world we're living in now where you judge your email by who people have given to which campaigns. That's the sort of thing I'm a little bit more concerned about than prosecutorial abuse. I just don't think it's something that certainly I'm sure goes on, but I don't think it's this massive epidemic.
Let me just add that I think that the kind of the view and the fear that you're channeling is consistent with Thomas's opinion and seems like an utterly minority opinion in the world of campaign finance, but does bear on or seem to bear on larger concerns in the post-Snowden world and when we have Europe demanding a right to be forgotten and concerns as data is so much more available that we might 10, 15 years down the road have a changing view of all the information about us that is disclosed and the appropriate and inappropriate ways for it to be used. I don't know what that looks like in the near term or what it looks like related to campaign finance, but there's clearly this sentiment that you're expressing, I think, that is a concern about just data out there and who's using it for what that we are only beginning to really figure out.
I would agree that the world has changed significantly since the 74 law laid out the disclosure requirements, and we haven't reacted to that in a policy sense. In 74, $200 was a much larger sum than it is today. I haven't done the inflation math, but it's probably closer to $800 or $1,000. That was one thing. Secondly, when I got to the FEC in the 1990s, there was always a line at the front door because the ground floor had the file cabinets, and the file cabinets had the reports. And that's how the press got the information. You had to go to the FEC and go through file cabinets to look and see who gave to people. Well, we're obviously in a radically different world where you can tell from an email what their history is. You can use an app to find out what your neighbors have given. It is clearly time, if nothing else, to inflation adjust those numbers and probably to think about other systems. Heather mentioned, and none of us have discussed, the Ackerman idea of being able to give in some sort of a black box. The concept is you can support the candidates you want and no one needs to know who you are if you put the money in a government-sponsored black box and it gives it to the candidate and it doesn't tell the candidate who it's from because it avoids the nexus with corruption, so there's not a governmental interest in requiring disclosure. That to me is, it may not be the only system you have, but it might be an intriguing way to incorporate it for people who are concerned about disclosure while still avoiding the corruption.
Thank you for your question.
I want to thank you all, first of all, for challenging everything I thought I knew about elections and the connection between transparency and disclosure and outcomes. I do hear in gentlemen on the end, you were connecting transparency with some issues of control. And I'm not sure all values need to have definite outcomes. That they have to be guaranteed outcomes. I think a value is there as a value. It's a goal. It's something we shoot for. What I wanted to ask you about was your views on public campaign finance, because I recently had some correspondence with Jack Abramoff with the idea of bringing him to New Haven to speak on the issue of public campaign finance. We actually have a democracy fund here in New Haven. It's an experiment in Connecticut. New Haven's the only town that's actually set it up. And even though Abramoff in his documentary is very clear that money generates corruption, he's absolutely, you can stop all your research on that. Jack Abramoff will show up for, I don't know, $5,000 or whatever, and tell you what he has learned. But,
that's very sporting of him.
Yes, isn't it? But
you're here for free.
Yes.
He wouldn't go so far as to endorse public campaign finance. So I thought, what are the options? If disclosure doesn't work, if transparency is hit or miss, if even convicted felons don't think public campaign finance is an option, when you dream in the privacy of your minds, what do you dream of that will work?
What a question! That's a great question. It's a great question. I guess my initial response is, and this is a typical professorial thing, is to come back with a question, which is, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And that's in some sense, I think, tied in with the transparency debate. I've been starting to wonder over the last few years, why the focus on money? So if we're concerned that voters don't need to make better decisions. If Larry Lessig, who had spent millions of dollars with his PAC trying to get candidates elected who cared about campaign finance and failed miserably, if he had spent that money sending out voter guides, right, telling people in close races where their candidates stood on the issues, I would argue that would have been a much better service to democracy for Lessig to undertake. Now, of course, he raised the money, not me, so he can do what he pleases with it. But the idea that the problem is money and that we need to solve money and that we need to tell more people about who's spending money and why, I guess the question always comes back to what problem exactly are we trying to solve? And we've talked about the informational rationale and the anti-corruption rationale, but there are arguments that transparency actually facilitates corruption. I'm not sure I buy them, but certainly those arguments are out there. Because it sort of builds on why Ackerman and Aries had sort of argued for keeping these things anonymous, which is that you don't want candidates to know who's giving to their campaigns. So I guess my initial instinct is I'm not sure, because I'm not sure exactly what problem it is that reformers often want to solve. So I'm sorry if that's a little wishy-washy, but I think that's sort of what I'm sort of puzzling with, and maybe.
Someone else must have a dream.
They want to solve a problem that they're not allowed to solve. So I think reformers want to solve the distortion problem, the inequality problem, and the outsized influence that wealthy donors have as opposed to poor people. More people with one vote versus wealthy donors with $1 billion. The Sheldon Edelson primary, right? They want to solve that problem. They can't solve that problem. Why? Supreme Court told them equality is off the table, so they're not allowed to talk about equality. So they have to move to corruption. And then the Supreme Court tells them, well, when we're talking about corruption, we're talking about something super narrow. Okay, so now we have to move to a different portion. So I think that the clear-eyed reformer only thinks at best that what you get out of disclosure is enough transparency maybe to get the reform game going for the big game that they really want to hunt. But that's, they have been moved over the last few decades into an argument that is so much weaker and so paltry by comparison. And they can't even tell you really that they want to hunt the big game, right? Because they can't tell you, look, we just really need to get a handle on where the money is going so that we can get some bigger reform, because no big reform is allowed to be passed right now. So you're asking them to do something in some ways that the Supreme Court has told them they're not allowed to do, which is why I think it has shifted so dramatically. They're fighting over something that what's left to fight about. But that is not the core issue.
But I'm sorry, go ahead, Ray.
Well, I was going to say, I wouldn't even have I have some public financing schemes. But if I were going to push something, I would, on the equity issue, I'd say compulsory voting. Make everybody vote. You get people to the polls. It's the people who vote and don't vote. They do have different opinions. Political scientists have been saying a long time they don't, but more and more they do have different opinions on issues. And it's never going to happen, at least not in the next 20 years. I can't see it happening because even liberals say, you can't make me vote. It's just ingrained. But I think that would deal with the money problem because you wouldn't have to mobilize as many voters. They have to show up for the polls. Politicians would have to appeal to those people. Now, you might end up spending a lot more money on ads to appeal to those people. That's true. But it's going to change the terms of debate when you're talking about a different audience, particularly in primaries, too.
Jump in?
Well, my back was rising as I heard the question addressed to, or the conversation dealing with what reformers want. I'm sometimes labeled a reformer, but I'm a citizen. Everyone in this room is interested in what makes democracy work, so I don't think it's the reformer's job to try to fix the mess we're in. It is all of our jobs to fix the mess we're in. And the issue we're trying to address is how do you have a democracy where people get information about candidates and are able to vote, encouraged to vote. I mean, actually requiring people to vote seems to me like actually a pretty good idea. But the problem is, how do we finance that? And we are different than other countries. We're not a parliamentary democracy. That changes things. We don't have a broadcast system which is owned by the government and provides free time as most of the European democracies do. So we have a unique set of problems, but it boils down to how are we going to get the money to enable candidates to communicate with voters and other people to speak about these issues without corruption? Whether that is public funding, free airtime, requiring people to vote, the basic still is we all want the same thing in a way that is not corrupt, that is not selling, in my view, access, but if you're the Supreme Court, you say at least not selling outcomes. Those are pretty fundamental questions that we've been struggling with as a democracy really since politics moved from being local and people talking on soapboxes to requiring the expenditure of a large amount of money to communicate with a broader number of people. And that's what, about 1870 or so, I guess.
Let me just push one point, because there's a tension, I think, a little bit between particularistic interests spending a lot of money to get their thing done, right? You're one corporation and you want to spend money to get one particular policy done, and then donors who just want one side to win because we're in this polarized environment where all their eggs are in one side's basket, and so their best interests for whatever issue they care about is just to have one side win. And there seems to be, we might have a value judgment differently depending on like what we don't care about one side just trying to further its interest of the side, but we do care about the particularistic interest. And this ties into what you're saying about, I think, Justice Kennedy's view about, well, a corporation being outed for articulating its particularistic interest, that outing is very positive because it brings light to this self-interested reason for wanting to engage in elections. But for the generic and partisan interest, do you have a different view about what's at stake there?
That's the point that Ray and David were making earlier about some of these studies that are showing that individual donors tend to be more polarized. The PACs that were referred to are the corporate interests that want some specific piece of legislation. So they give to both sides because they're looking for an outcome. But the individuals want their side to win. Very few individuals give to both parties. You tend to give to one or the other. So that may be you're stuck on this spot. Do you want more individual involvement and potentially more polarized, or do you want the PACs and the outcome being what drives it?
We have 3 people left standing, so why don't we, if you don't mind, each asking your questions, and then we only have 5 more minutes, so if you each ask the question, then we'll deal with all of them together.
Sure. So you mentioned 2 types of disclosure, the disclosure forms that are filed with the FEC, with the IRS, with agencies. and disclaimers, the things that would appear on an advertisement, either in the newspaper, on television, or the radio. How should we think sort of differentially about the benefits and the costs associated or concerns associated with those two different types of disclosure that are part of our current disclosure regime?
Thank you. Good question.
Thanks for a great panel. I guess I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the failure of super donors in the last couple of cycles to have an apparent influence. So the Tom Steyers and American Crossroads 2 years ago totally failed. They lost every election they were in, save one for Tom Steyer. The donors are sort of effectively known. You know who NextGen is. You know that it's all Tom Steyer money, so you already have disclosure. Does that tell us anything about what the impact of disclosure might be more broadly? And also, Ray, I don't think you ever told us what the onion reform would be. Would you hear about that?
Oh, yeah. To make candidates anonymous. I was going to mention it, but I didn't want to get confused. Candidates, complete anonymity. We don't know who they are. Protect their free speech without being punished.
Responses?
So on the, I feel like I should respond because those are both my students. I could talk to them tomorrow in class. But I think that on the disclosure disclaimer front, the thing that's really useful about disclaimers is it goes after the big donor. It's right attached to the ad, so it's more legible sometimes to voters because they're not going to go look up the FEC numbers. And it's also attached to the really big money, whereas disclosure rules sort of go from the tiny little donor where we probably don't need that information, it's not worth the cost, to the big donors where it's very useful to have that information. So I think that's how I would draw the distinction. And disclaimers are harder to get through, which is why they get dropped every time there's any pressure on a reform bill. But they do have a nice feature, which is that they're focused on the big money, and they may we still don't know, provide some heuristic for voters.
Regarding the other question, Tom Steyer, did he lose? I don't know. I mean, he got his message across nationally about climate change, and if I was a Democrat, I'd be thinking twice in a primary before saying anything against positions he's taken. So, it's a long-term investment for him. He said as much. I assume this guy's smart, that he's made a lot of money. He knows his odds, and so he must be thinking about this long-term.
The other side of that, of course, is if I heard you right, you referred to American Crossroads losing everything. That was, of course, in the last election in 2010. They won pretty much everything this time. So maybe the answer is you just keep at it. They would say you keep at it, you improve your game, you figure out what you did wrong, and you change it. And I would agree with Ray that coming out of this election, both Steyer and American Crossroads were winners in the sense that they both now are significant power players in the American political system, dictating policies, able to at least get attention to the policies they care about. And that's true of the other major donors, the major players here. What we're seeing, which is I think, taking a while to sink in, is we're seeing that where we used to have people who donated to parties, you now have people who are creating their own political machines. American Crossroads, more particularly on the Republican side, the whole Koch machine, which is separate from the party. It supports Republican candidates, but it's not the party. Steyer on the Democratic side, some of the others. So we're moving into a world where you're going to have these major centers of political power who are individuals by virtue of their money.
Let me just close with a charge to the students in the room. For those of you who are in my election law and campaign strategy class, you know that I referenced earlier this semester a contest underway to come up with standards for determining whether a gerrymandering was on political grounds ought to be unconstitutional. There's a contest for this. Who can ever come up with an idea for a good way to understand partisan gerrymandering? You can win money. And so I think after this conversation, I would say there is a lot of room for us to figure this out. And so if you have an idea about how we could do this right, a problem that needs to be solved, a solution to that problem, how we might test it, there will be a lot of people paying attention and listening because we know a lot, but we have a lot to learn as well. And this panel has really helped us, I think, get a long way in learning. And so I'd like to thank all the panelists and thank all of you for coming. Please